Gateway House weekly briefing podcast, where we look at major events that happened this past week and look at the next week ahead. Neelam, why don't you run us through some of the important events that happened this past week, starting with US President Obama's visit to Asia?
I think that the President's visit, which continued from last week, took him in the course of this week to South Korea, to Malaysia, to the Philippines. This visit was important because the United States was asserting itself as an Asian power, and it was trying to reassure each of these allies that its security commitments would be fulfilled. This is, of course, a message to China that it is both going to be present in the Asia-Pacific continually, and that it is wary of what is seen as expansionism by China's neighbors. The Chinese, of course, were strong in condemning the statements by President Obama in Japan and in the Philippines. But I think they also recognized the importance of President Obama counseling dialogue, peaceful means of resolving the differences, and a desire for all the countries not to engage in hostilities that would also disturb the economic exchanges underway. The actual extent of Chinese seriousness or concern will become evident in the forthcoming visit of President Putin of Russia to Beijing. It will be seen in the extent of energy cooperation that they are able to agree to, and in the kind of statements made in support of Russia in regard to the crisis in the Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. Looking ahead, what can we expect to see in terms of the situation in Ukraine?
The situation in the Ukraine, on the ground, in eastern Ukraine, is quite tentative. It's quite unstable, with more and more small town buildings being taken over by pro-Russian protesters. Unfortunately, the government in Kiev has simultaneously admitted that it is unable to control this process, but also begun military action against the protesters. It has no credibility in the capacity of its armed forces, but nevertheless it is providing the justification for pro-Russian protesters to harden their positions. Meanwhile, the United States and the EU have announced more sanctions. Again, not very serious, but how far the Western Bloc will be able to go will become clear during the forthcoming visit of German Chancellor Angela Merkel in Washington next week.
Okay, switching to elections, and apart from India, of course, there will be 4 important elections in Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, and Syria. What's your take on this?
Well, the whole region is really unstable, and there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of violence. To begin with, of course, the on-again, off-again peace process between Israel and the Palestinians has been called off, and no one really expected anything to come out of this. The elections in Iraq did have some violent incidents, and there were more casualties actually than in the election in Afghanistan a few weeks ago. But what it does show is that enough people in Iraq who take courage and come out to vote despite the continuing sectarian violence and the threats from terrorist groups. Unlike that in Algeria, where people are very listless about the fact that the more or less dictatorship of Bouteflika continues. So, of course, he has won the election again, but in fact, nobody expects him to even be able to get through the full term of the presidency. There are other elections which will come somewhat later, and they will be very important both in Egypt and Syria.